So, what can we learn with the Great Depression, as well as the most recent, the economic crash in Venezuela?
Yeah, there's a number of things we can learn from the Depression, from nations that have had hyperinflation, Zimbabwe.
Hi, I'm Meryl Pettit, clinical nutritionist here at Kitch'n Gardens, and today we have Mr. Chad Kreuzer from Health and Homestead. So, I would like to ask you some questions. How did you get into homesteading?
Well, from a child, I grew up in the city, and there was something in me. My grandparents had a cottage in the country on a river, and I loved being there so much that I thought as a kid, why don't we live in a place like this rather than living in the city on a postage stamp type tiny little property? And so as I got older and I got married, my wife was also interested. Before we got married, we both had an interest in moving to the country, but it took us years of marriage to be able to save up enough money. And we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't.
Mm.
And so for us, we didn't have enough money to go buy acreage and buy a house. So we bought acreage with just trees on it. And it then we were, you know, it was something that I always had a burden to do. And then slowly we went through the process. We spent months living in a tent and sleeping out there with no toilet, no running water,
Wow.
nothing. And then finally we spent months felling trees. We finally built our house. And so we were too poor to go the route where you just go buy a really nice house in the country. We would have loved to do that if we didn't have the money, but we did what I think a lot of young people are going to have to do these days, and that's go the cheaper route and kind of go at it yourself. And it's
Yeah.
hard, it's not easy. It was very difficult, but it was also very fulfilling.
So, what lessons have you taken from them having that experience?
One of them has to do with delayed gratification. We live in a time
That's a good
where
one.
people think about they don't think about it, but almost everything in life right now is about instant or
That's true.
immediate
Instant
gratification.
gratification.
So right now, I want, like, for instance, if you want to look at something, you can tell the internet and it gives you exactly what you want immediately. And no human can ever do that for you. So people kind of like the internet more than they do humans, sadly. But nevertheless, living out there and taking the slow time of felling trees and then I didn't have heavy equipment. So it was using a chainsaw, and then it was using a wheelbarrow, pushing it up a hill, a few logs at a time, and it was a slow, laborious process. And then, you know, getting firewood. Well, the firewood you cut today
Mm.
isn't for this week or next month, it's for next
It's
year because it has to dry. And so then growing food, you don't put a seed in the ground and then go pluck it tomorrow. I
mhm,
mean, sure, you can do microgreens or whatever, and that can be relatively quick, not the next
mhm.
day necessarily, but that's quick. But typically, if you're going to grow food, it
Like
takes months.
months.
And almost everything you do living in the country, as far as naturally, it kind of teaches you delayed gratification. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I'm learning. I can say I can't say, oh,
Yes.
now I have all absolute delayed gratification, but that's one of the greatest things I've
Yes.
been learning in these last several years.
And so living in the country and having that kind of experience, how long have you been doing that?
So we've lived in the country at different times, but never owned
Okay.
anything. And then it was 2017 when we finally found the land that we found. We had enough money to purchase it. And so we just bought the land. And then it took from 2017 to the end of 2019 to
Yes.
build our house. And finally, at the end of 2019, just before COVID came in 2020. And we were thankful because we travel full time,
Mhm.
and so we'd be there for a few months working and then not working and then traveling. And we were so thankful when COVID came that we had a place to stay because our house was finished just before that.
Yeah, so what was it like having that country living with, I mean, during COVID, during the pandemic, and what was your day like?
It was fantastic actually. And I don't mean for the people who lost
Mm,
loved ones. I feel for
yeah.
all of those. I mean, my wife lost an uncle and so forth. But for us where we were, it was when we would go to the city, we realized there was a pandemic.
Yeah.
lockdowns,
Down.
face masks, waiting in line outside in the cold to get food. I mean, it was insanity, literal insanity. But nevertheless, then we'd go back to the country, and it was like it didn't exist almost because I could walk off our properties right next to the national forest. I could walk up. It was pure freedom, and
Like you're in your little bubble.
yes, and then
Oh,
and then during the day, once the warm weather was there, we're planting, we're
wow.
working on the garden, working on the property, cutting wood, doing what you do on a homestead. And it was, to be honest, it was one of the greatest. The time of COVID was one of the greatest experiences of my life because we were just so free. I didn't actually have income. We didn't take the money from the government. Literally, God just kind of blessed us. I mean, we sell online and we do things, but so we had enough money to make it, but it was, and we could have taken the money, but we just, I mean, meaning we could have sought, more money from the government. Obviously, they gave everybody a little bit here and there, but beside that, we were just homegrown food, and
Wow.
we were doing Zoom meetings because we speak, and so we were
Mm-hmm.
connecting with people around the world that way. But yeah, it was actually a blessing, I've got to say.
Yeah. And what was your greatest challenge or the greatest challenges you have experienced that have helped you when it comes to your homesteading?
Yeah, we've gone through a number of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned the felling of trees. If I were to buy a property again, I wouldn't buy just a solid forest unless I was going to rent heavy machinery. I mean, we were too poor for that, so it was just a chainsaw. And it was so much labor and so
Labor.
much work. At this point in my life, I wouldn't want to do that
That,
much again. So that was a lot of work. The other thing is we don't have very good soil. We have very sandy soil, and that is kind of a difficult thing. If I ever bought again, I would want to most properties don't have prime soil,
mm-hmm.
but the trouble with sand is that it's not pure sand, but it's like it leaches things through. So even if you add
I
things to it, it
see.
just kind of
Okay.
leaches through. So that's another difficulty we've had. But you know what? You learn from everything you
Everything.
do, and that's part of life is
Yeah.
learning from either mistakes or just from trials that you go through.
Yes. And with that, I wanted to ask you, like, for people who wanted to start homesteading, what can you share to them as lessons that you've learned?
There's a few things that I think if you're looking for country property, it it is something that is partially contingent on can you make a living in the country?
Mm-hmm.
That is a real key thing. So, do you have a job where, I mean, if you're like a medical professional, you can go anywhere almost because there's work everywhere, especially in country areas. It can be easy to get a medical job, but not everybody's in that field. And so, are you someone who can make a living online?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you very handy? I mean, do you do construction? There's many things I have a couple videos on talking about things you can do to make a living in
Yeah.
the country. So, number one, can you make a living? And don't run to the country if you can't make a living.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, like figure that part
Yeah.
out first because it's going to be a nightmare if you don't know how to make a living. And so that's number one. But number two, what are your finances like? If you're someone like me, who was I considered myself, I mean, not desperately poor. We had saved enough to buy 20 acres in
Piece.
the country,
Yeah.
and things are way more expensive today than in
Mm-hmm.
2017. But um, even a couple acres, you could grow if you have good ground. Couple acres, you could grow everything you needed for your family to survive on that kind of property. So you don't need 20, 30, 40, 100 acres or something
Yeah.
like that. Um, it's always nice to have more, but uh, so you don't need a lot, number two, but it also comes down to your finances. What do you have? What can you afford? And you got to kind of work with it. If you were more poor like us, you're going to have to work much harder. And if you have more money, it's not that hard. You can just go sell your house in the city and go buy a place in the country. It's not that big of a deal for you. It's not as complex, but uh, I, I would be cautious, and you should know what you're about before you go, because there are people who do it because other people say it or they're afraid of what's happening in the world and they just rush out there. And
Yes.
I
Because of fear. And then
yes,
they just
and then they're
go.
there and it
Yeah.
doesn't go as well, or it's way more difficult. Like it's been super difficult, but to be honest, I love, like, it's been extremely fulfilling. But other people, they go out there and like, oh, it's so much work, I can't stand it. I even see there's YouTubers who were country living YouTubers, and they're finally like, ah, we're moving to the city, this is just too much work. And I get it. If uh, you're either going to have to like to work or learn to like to
Or
work, and you
learn.
can learn to like to work, by the way, you really can.
Yeah.
But or you need plenty of money to pay somebody else to do the work
Mm-hmm.
for you. And so I'm not that guy. I don't have that kind of money to pay everybody to do it for me. And so um, it is a personal thing. And make sure you know what you're doing, and read up on it, study up, and before you do it.
Those are really good points to consider. And with the shift to industrial revolution, or the first industrial revolution in 1780, we have mechanization, second industrial revolution, which is electrification, that's in 1870, third industrial revolution in 1970, that is automation, and then with the fourth industrial revolution 2011, that's digitalization, and we are now in the fifth industrial revolution, which is personalization. Do you think homesteading still has its place, and why?
You know, it's interesting because they've already started doing like robot based agriculture where they can literally have no human involved in the whole process from
Wow.
planting to the whole process of taking care of the plants and then finally harvesting.
Harvesting.
And so
Wow.
the time is going to come where I think that's going to be like the main deal in the world.
Hmm.
And so someone like me, I'm not going to stop plant seeds in the ground. You're not sure I may have a machine that you can have a planter or things like this,
Yes.
but meaning I'm still going to be a hands-on guy no matter what, because there's so many benefits to being out there in the sun, to the labor, the fresh air, the sunlight, the work for your muscles, for your brain.
Mhm.
There's so many things out there. And there's always going to be people like myself who are going to want to be in connection with nature. I think the future is people living in, most people are going to live in skyscrapers, and
Mhm.
they're going to be in these tiny little buildings, and they're just going to have their Apple Vision Pro on their face covering, and they won't even have to spend time with humans anymore, and they won't be happy that way. I mean,
Yes.
you can't be happy that
Yeah.
way.
You have to have a purpose.
You do. Being in touch with nature, and that's why nearly 70% of Americans, a survey was done within the last 2 years since COVID
Mhm.
started. Nearly 70% of Americans said that they want to move to the country. And so,
Wow.
which is an amazing
Yes,
number,
that's staggering.
because
Yeah.
typically it's people been moving from the cities or from the country to the
Country to the
city, right?
city.
And so
Okay.
now there's this. I think people are realizing this, urbanization. People, the research shows too, people are way less happy. The higher the density
City
of people,
people. Yeah.
the less happy people are, and the further you get out in the country, the more happy people are. And so you think, oh, you're all off alone all the time. Actually, I think a lot of times people in the country are more open to being social
Social.
than, because you actually crave it. Whereas when
Exactly.
there's thousands of people around you, I mean, in New York City, I'm not putting down people who live there. I've spent time there, and people don't even want to look at each other because there's a
Yes.
mass of bodies. And in the country, you're planting your seeds, and you're like, man, I'd love to go to prayer meeting and talk to somebody at church or whatever it is, because
It
there's
becomes more personal, and the approach as well,
yes, yeah,
of wanting to be with people and to mingle with them on a deeper level.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. So, thinking about homesteading, and what do you think are the tools that, well, people could use when it comes to homesteading?
And so we got the land, and we started off with a chainsaw, a shovel. You got like a knife. Like we were pretty archaic. I mean, we weren't like the pioneers coming into America just with an axe or something like that.
Okay.
I did have an axe. And you have these things, and I would split wood with an axe. In the beginning, I didn't have a log splitter. Now I do, and that makes the
Okay,
process
it's
easier.
easier.
But
Yeah.
honestly, starting off with what you have.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things I talked about on our channel, because we started off, I had very little. And as time went on, you save up more money. Actually, somebody gifted me a log splitter. I mean,
Wow.
what a blessing that was. And so, but the point is, you start with what you
We
have,
have,
and don't
yes.
feel like, because you'll see these YouTubers or these country living people, and they'll have the latest high tech machinery. And if you can afford that, I mean,
That's great.
yeah, I mean, having all these things is wonderful, but don't feel like you have to have
Yes.
that.
Mhm.
Having some primitive tools,
Tools.
you can do what you got to do, especially if you
Yes.
got a family with children. And if I had children, the Lord has not blessed my wife and I with kids, but if He did, my kids would be working out there with me, and they would believe that it is up to our survival to get that food, and it is, because
Yes.
we grow food, and that's
Yeah.
part of our life. I would not. Many times, kids today, like, they don't feel like they have any purpose because they don't. It's like maybe you make them clean dishes, maybe not. Like, they just
Yeah.
kind of play all the time, and
Right.
there's nothing wrong with playing.
Mhm.
Playing's a good thing for kids, but the whole point is, being in a place like this, I would have my children working with me. They'd have their own little tools. They'd be
Yeah.
learning to do it. And so as far as getting tools, I would say start off with the simplest things you can get if you can't afford any more, and work your way up over time. And you find that slowly. There's a verse in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11 that says, um, it says that he that gathers little by little will increase it. It actually starts by saying wealth gained hastily will dwindle,
Mm-hmm.
but he who gathers little by little will increase it. You can learn a lot from that. But the whole point is you gather little by
By
little.
little.
You start with one thing,
Yeah.
you add another, and in time you're like, hey, I have a lot of the things
Yes.
that I hoped I would have, but it took me years to get there.
Yes.
Many young people today want everything their parents had by the
Yeah.
time their parents were 60. And they think like when they come out of college, they should have everything their parents had. And I'm not judging anybody for that, but it took your parents typically a
Yeah.
lifetime to get there. And for many of us who've homesteaded, it took us years
Yeah.
also to get to the point we're at now.
Yeah, and for those who are looking for cheaper tools, you can get that are good quality. There are also used tools
That
that you can buy. You don't have to go to the store that sold brand new good stuff, and you could start from there.
totally, totally. And
Yeah.
I think that's used things. Sometimes you win with a loose used thing, and sometimes it doesn't go well. I just bought something used and it didn't turn out good.
Yeah.
But there are other times where I get it and I'm like, oh, this is perfect. I'm glad I bought this used. And so that's also how you get ahead when you don't have a lot of money is use things.
Yes. So for people who wanted to build up their homesteading skills, what do you think are the important homesteading skills to have?
I would say the rudimentary aspects of life on the homestead are you have number one, you need to have shelter. And we have friends who maybe have gone years in tents. Now, us, it was months in tents because
Okay.
I'm up in the north and it gets very cold. And
Cold.
so in the winter, I
Yeah.
wasn't in the tent. We were traveling.
Mm-hmm.
But when it was relatively warm, we'd be in a tent. But shelter is number one. And we have a friend, their family is in it's a nice tarp tent. And I'm not talking like it like and
Yeah.
they're living a good life like that. There are people who
Wow.
you can do it. I mean, to begin with, I know some people be like, you're crazy. And if you think you're crazy, don't live in a tent. I was crazy. My wife was willing to do it and we were happy in that situation. That may not be for you.
Yeah.
So you have to decide what you can handle.
Handle.
Obviously you got to have water. So you either need, a spring or a well. I have a well.
Yeah.
So you need water, but that's not really a skill. You just have
Yeah.
to have that there.
Carpentry
Yeah,
skills.
carpentry skills are something
Good.
to learn, and
Yes.
also, I mean, growing food. I think
Yeah.
on a
Gardening
homestead, gardening.
skills.
Many, one of the billionaires in our nation who was running for president a number of years ago, not one that became president. He said, farming is so simple. You just put a seed in the ground. Anybody could do that. So says a person who's never gardened. Realize it is a
Life.
lifetime of work and a
Yes.
lifetime of
Laborious.
learning.
Yes.
It
It
takes
is.
it takes
It
forever.
is.
So, but learning how to do it, and you may watch some YouTubers says, I do this and I put this on my and it works amazing, and you try it in your area and that doesn't work
Didn't
at
work.
all. But
Yeah.
his plants look amazing. And part of the issue is that different soils,
Soils.
different climates, and different methods. And so just because it
Yes.
works for somebody else,
Exactly.
you have to learn how that works in your own area. But I think gardening is one of the most important things, and having some kind of way to make a living. And so
Yes.
that can be cottage industry is something you can do from home. It doesn't have to be, but sometimes if you have a husband who works outside and a wife who stays home, it can be nice for her to have some kind of cottage industry that
Yes.
she can
Can
do.
do.
And maybe, and as soon as the kids are old enough to start, obviously based on their skill, and you understand, you don't want
Yeah.
to be
Interests as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
interest. But if you can do that, that can be fulfilling to those children too, because
Yeah.
we know families in the country who their kids get into businesses, and now they run some of the big businesses in the industry, like Farmer's Friend. Farmer's Friend is a company that makes
Wow.
greenhouses, and
Mm-hmm.
this is from some friends of ours who they homeschooled their kids, and they the kids grew up on the farm, working the farm, and because of that, these kids have diligence, and now they start,
Making their
multi-million
own.
dollar
Wow.
businesses as a result of it. Same thing with homeschool kids starting another seed company, one of the most popular, rareseeds.org or com, Baker Creek
Yeah.
heirloom
Big
seeds, same kind of thing. Guys mailing out 1 million catalogs a
logs.
year. I mean, I can't even imagine.
Wow.
He started just as a homeschooler doing this stuff. And this is what happens with families who get their kids working. And we're not talking slave labor.
Yeah.
We're talking about something that humanity did since the beginning of time.
So what can we learn with the Great Depression, as well as the most recent, the economic crash in Venezuela.
Yeah, there's a number of things we can learn from the depression, from nations that have had hyperinflation, Zimbabwe, um, Weimar Republic in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of things we can learn. My great grandmother lived during the Depression,
Oh,
and she told us personally how they lost a house because of
oh,
debt during that time. And so my goal was actually to build with no debt.
mm-hmm.
And so we bought the land without debt, and we started building and building. And well, we did go into debt.
Yeah.
Praise the Lord, God's helped us to pay it off. But um, but the point is, praise the Lord, we had as little as possible also. And my point isn't that nobody should ever have any debt. I don't
Yeah.
believe that most people won't be able to do it without any debt. If you can, that's great. But the point is, you're more likely to lose things that way. But looking at my great grandma, she lost a house and she decided, I'll never buy another house until I can pay it off cash. And she did that. And I don't mean that you have to do that, but not living to the maximum extent of what you can be in debt. So just because your bank tells you you could buy a $500,000 house, but really maybe you should be more. I'm not telling you personally, but maybe,
250
yeah,
or
maybe you should be in a
200.
253 or whatever. And so depending on your income, different
Yes.
persons with different incomes, it's different. Somebody can afford a $700,000 house depending on their job. But my point is, don't go to the max of your ability to borrow.
Wow.
Leverage sounds great, and all these YouTubers telling you, but the fact is that it sounds great until you lose everything, and then it's a nightmare. And the
Yeah.
stress that comes with losing everything is very difficult. Uh,
Especially for marriage as well.
it is. That's one of the primary reasons for
Yeah.
divorce or
Yeah.
financial
Finance.
troubles. So we can learn that from them. The other thing is learning to grow food. I don't mean to beat a dead horse, as it were, but during economic times, one of the things when they looked at like the Weimar Republic in Germany is that the people who did financially well were actually peasants. And typically, when you think peasants, you think poor people,
Yeah.
right? But they did well because they owned little plots of
Lots of
land in the
land
country and they grew
and
food.
food.
And as the hyperinflation was taking place, the worth of the mark there in Germany went from like 4 marks to the dollar to over just a few years, it was like 4 billion to the dollar. And I'm not exaggerating by saying that. But what happens is that can be very difficult on you. But the price of food
Food
always went up with
doesn't really.
inflation.
Yeah.
So these people who could grow food, not only for the sustenance of
Mm-hmm.
their own family, but it could also be selling food, they did financially fine during those times. And I believe that's what's going to happen again as times get more difficult
Yeah.
again, that we are going to come upon there's going to be inflation even in the United States. It is coming sooner or later. I don't know when, but it is coming sooner or later. And one of the things that can offset and stabilize people as much as possible is being able to grow as much food as possible.
Yes. And thank you for sharing that because that actually mirrors what happened with Venezuela.
Yes.
Because most people in the countryside actually did well and they were growing their food. They had a plot of land,
Yeah.
and those ones who have roofs and the side of their houses, they grew all different kinds of food, and it sustained them during that hyperinflation. So that is really critical.
It is. And even if you think like, oh, my family, we make plenty of money, we don't need to grow any food. If you have the ability to do it, and you got kids especially, I would have them out there. It's one of the best things it will help your kids, like we mentioned
Yeah,
earlier, learn to have
like
delayed
delayed
gratification. It's
gratification.
just, and just for their
And practical skills.
practical skills getting, because many children today, because they're on the two-dimensional screen, they actually have they lack even physical
Physical
skills like
skills.
climbing up on the monkey bars and these kind
Yeah,
of things, because they're just not using their body. But in the garden, you're gonna use your body. It's going to actually enhance your intellect as a result.
yes. A lot of teachers are actually trying to get away from teaching for the reason that even the children doesn't have the muscle to hold the pencil and start writing because they are so used to holding the iPads, and so their muscle is not even, it's limited in their movement, and that's really serious.
Yeah.
Like even just holding a pencil, they couldn't even do it in the schools.
Not having skills, not being able to do things, because they don't use their bodies. And
Yes.
that's whereas we used to just play outside. That was a part of life, but it's kind of gone by the wayside. It used to be in the summer, you'd go down any neighborhood, there'd
Yes.
be kids
The
everywhere. Now you seldom see kids
see.
outside.
It's real sad. So the last 100 years, we've lost 90% of biodiversity when it comes to crops. So where can we find seeds that are organic, non-GMO, that we can start growing our own food?
There are a number of sources where you can get either organic or non-GMO, and they're not always the same, meaning some things are not organic. Like, for instance, one of the ones that won't always be organic, but I mentioned them, Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds or Rare Seeds. I think it's org, but maybe .com,
Mm-hmm.
rareseeds.com. And theirs are going to be non-GMO. They're not all going to be organic. So if you're looking to be properly organic, maybe not. But the great thing about them is they have a diversity of things that you won't be able to find in many other places. So you might be able to, one of the things is when you're growing your own food, is it can be wise to try a diversity of different, let's say, squash,
Yeah.
and find out, wow, this one works really good on my property. These other ones don't do well.
Yeah.
Well, once you do that, if you let them all go to seed at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to spread their genetics amongst
That's
all of them,
right.
and you're going to get Franken squash. Then you're not, the next generation is going to be different.
Yeah.
So find out which ones do well on your
Mhm.
property, and then basically the next year have some seed, pure seed that hasn't been pollinated by the other ones. You can start over, and now you know it's good on your property.
Yeah.
And then within a year or so, even if they weren't originally organic seed, after that you've got them as something that you've personally used. So you may not be using the toxic chemicals, which would be good. So that's one place that I like because of their diversity and finding things that you can't find anywhere else. The other one, though, that is kind of one of the main places for organic farmers and small ag kind of place, not big ag places so much, is called Johnny's Select Seeds.
Yeah.
And Johnny's Seeds is fantastic. They're meticulous. Like what they give you is going to grow almost guaranteed. They will tell you this. They'll tell you exactly what the germination rate is because they've tested it. You may not always have the same results of germination from rare seeds. You might, just depending on what you get. But I like it because you get to learn and try different things. But Johnny's is going to give you stuff that's extremely trustworthy, and not everything's organic, but it'll tell you if it's organic. And so if you're looking specifically for organic, they have organic seed. You can get those for various varieties on there. And Johnny's is just a great source if you want to know about things. They're top notch.
Baker's Creek and Johnny Select Seed.
Yeah, those are to me.
Yeah.
And then if you're local, let's say there's one called Southern Exposure. They also have some good stuff there, and I mean there's a number of them out there, but Johnny's and Rare Seeds I think are two of my favorite probably.
So what are your thoughts on off-grid living or semi-off-grid living?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it kind of depends on your situation. Um, Especially, so for instance, I actually would have loved to go off grid, but in our initial situation, we travel so much and we live in an area where when people don't stay in the house all the time, they end up getting mold problems if they don't keep it heated or cooled, like cooled in the summer, heated in the winter. And so for us, we are actually on grid. I actually in time would like to move to another homestead and be off grid if I don't travel as much as I do now. We just did a video on someone who is grid tied. That's like what you would call kind of semi. You're not fully off grid, but if the grid goes down, you're still okay. And basically off grid means you're not hooked up to the telephone poles, just for those of you who are not savvy to this information. Off-grid means you're not hooked to the telephone pole. Maybe you have solar panels and then probably battery backup so that at night you'll have electricity when the sun isn't, you're going to kind of need that in an off-grid situation, unless you're just running on a generator or something like that. If you can handle it, it's a cool way to live, but it can be work once again because you do have to take it, like you're the power company, and if something goes wrong, you either got to deal with it or get somebody out there that can deal with it. So it does take more work. A friend that I just did a video on with, he is grid tied, so he does have battery backup. He has a bunch of solar panels, and it sends all his electricity into the grid. Well, some of it goes into his batteries. So if the grid goes down, he can still get electricity from his battery backup. I think there's a place absolutely for both. I do not think it
Okay.
is you
Yeah.
have to be 100% off the grid. And I'm not even off the grid at all. So,
Yeah.
but if the grid went down, I could get water out of my well,
Mhm.
and I can heat my house and I can cook my food. In a difficult situation, I'm way out in the country too, so I need to be prepared because things go down from time to
Yes.
time, especially when you live out far out. You're more prone to having trees knock the lines over or whatever. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, the difficulty for us is too, it would have cost a lot more up front, and we didn't have a lot of money
Yes.
to do it in such a way that if we were gone, we could run air conditioners and heat it all the time. And we use propane for that. But when we're home, we heat
Yeah.
100% with wood. But
Mm-hmm.
since we're not home all the time, like right now, we heat with propane.
Yeah, it's
So
basically finding where you're at and where you want to be and finding the balance.
yes, yeah, yeah. And you can slowly add to your off-grid setup. You maybe do a little bit in the beginning and you're very careful with your electric usage. And as you get more money, you can add more batteries and more
Solar
more solar
panels.
panels and what have you. So you can work your way into it also.
Yes. So what counsel have you taken to heart to do your homesteading or country living?
You know, um, I can say there's a physical blessing. One of the things is when I'm home working all the time, I don't need. I'm someone like, for instance, I'm away from home now. I'll be home away from home for over a month, and while I'm out, I'll maybe go for a run. I do push-ups, I do pull-ups, I do exercise because I don't have much
Mm.
physical work when I'm out at somebody else's place or if I'm staying in a hotel or whatever. So I exercise. One of the things I love about being home is I don't really even generally need to exercise because I stay super fit, lugging logs around, um, working on the property. There's just so much to do. So one of the things I love about country living is that it kind of forces you into a healthy lifestyle in and of
Yeah.
itself. So I enjoy that actually. And my hope is to stay young, not in years, but in body. And that's one of the ways that you can do it. So that's one thing that I really appreciate, just the health benefits. But also, one of the things, even maybe more so, that I enjoy is the spiritual benefit. There is a real spiritual experience of being with God in nature. You can have a relationship with God in the city, 100%. I'm not negating that. But there's just a little illustration. I was no, not backpacking, camping out at the base of Mount Hood in Oregon. And while we were there, um, I went off on a hike all alone, very, very quiet. And then I heard something coming at me from behind very quickly. It was like, and it scared me. And I turned around to look at what it was. And it was actually a bird flying at me. And it was every wing beat. It was every wing beat. And it was so loud.
Wow.
Whereas if I were in the city, I wouldn't even heard
Yeah.
because there's always this drone of noise in the city that you may not even notice because you're so used to it. When you're out in the country, I mean, I've heard literally the sound of butterfly wings. That's how quiet
Wow.
it sometimes gets. And when you're in those quiet situations, you can hear things you otherwise wouldn't have been able to hear.
Mhm.
And it's kind of true too spiritually that you can sense the voice of
To
God a little bit more in the country. Not that you
mm,
can't, you can have a relationship in the city. I'm not saying that. Uh, but there's just a deeper experience with God in the country. And so, uh, yeah, I can say that's one of the things that I've appreciated almost maybe more than anything, that.
thank you so much, Chad. And tell us about your health and homestead, because people who wanted to know more about this information, about starting their homestead and what they could do.
So yeah, we have a channel, a YouTube channel called Health and Homestead. You can either Google it or just go on YouTube and it's 3 words, Health and Homestead. And we teach people about country living. We talk about research on natural remedies. We often show ones that have been compared head to head with drug medication. And we're looking at the scientific journals themselves, and we're showing the ones that are generally been shown to be just as good or better than the standard medication with significantly less side effects. And so we talk about simple things like how to prepare firewood, food to grow. What are some of the best foods to grow to be able to help
Mhm.
sustain your family? And so you check that out at Health and Homestead.
Thank you so much. So choose life, choose health, and choose well. For after all is said and done, it's all about a matter of choice.